When I first saw him standing in the garden with a shovel in his hands and a strand of hair falling over his eyes, I didn't feel attraction. Not at all. What I felt was something quieter. Something like the sensation of remembering a melody you used to love but haven't heard in years. My husband had hired him without asking me, said the yard needed a strong back and he was too busy with meetings. I nodded, like always. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I found myself inventing errands just to pass near the window and see if he was still there. Sometimes he would wave. Sometimes I would wave back. Sometimes I wouldn't. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure what it meant anymore. My husband never noticed. He came home late and left early, smelling of expensive cologne and business lunches. I watched the seasons shift from inside that house, room by room, day by day. Until one afternoon, the boy with the shovel asked if he could fix the loose boards on the deck, before someone breaks their ankle. I told him yes, of course. But it wasn't the porch he mended that day. It was something else. Something I wasn't ready to admit even to myself. And what happened after that? I'll tell you everything. But before I share the secret that's been rotting behind my ribs for months, leave a comment below with where you're watching from, and answer this question. Have you ever crossed a line you thought you never would, only to wonder if it had always been there waiting for you? The first night in the new house, I couldn't sleep. The walls were too white, the air too still, and the bed too large. He snored beside me like always, gentle, rhythmic, indifferent. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between creaks in the floorboards. The house didn't feel like home yet. Maybe it never would. We'd bought it after 2 years of planning, saving, dreaming. He said it was the next chapter. I wanted to believe him. I still do. The next morning, he left early with a kiss on my forehead and a distracted promise to call. I wandered the house barefoot, still in my robe, noting what needed fixing: a dripping tap, a cracked tile, the overgrown garden. The garden was wild. Ivy climbed the fence like it wanted to escape. Weeds poked through gravel like stubborn memories. He told me he'd hired someone to help, a guy who did odd jobs, someone local. I said okay, but I didn't expect him to actually show up. But he did. Right before noon, I heard the gate creak and a soft knock on the back door. When I opened it, there he was. Tall, younger than I imagined, maybe mid-20s. He smiled. Said his name, said he'd come about the work. He had a relaxed kind of confidence, like he wasn't trying too hard. I showed him around the garden and tried not to seem nervous. Why was I nervous? I didn't know then. I still don't know, not exactly. He asked questions about the hedges, the irrigation, the cracks in the stone path. I answered politely, folding my arms across my chest even though the sun was warm. His eyes didn't wander. That should have made me feel safe. Somehow, it didn't. That afternoon, I sat inside with a cup of tea, watching him from the window. He moved easily, swinging tools with practiced grace. He whistled. No headphones, no phone. Just him and the work. I remembered when my husband used to whistle, back when we still shared jokes and silence wasn't a burden. That felt like a different life. By the end of the week, the garden looked more like itself, trimmed, clean, alive. He'd come every day, always early, always cheerful. We spoke more, mostly about the work, but sometimes about other things. He mentioned a sister in another state, a mother who baked too much, a dream of traveling. I told him about my old job, my move here, how strange it was to be in a place where no one knew me. He said, maybe that's a good thing. You get to start over. That night, I lay in bed thinking about those words. Start over. The idea clung to me, unsettling and tempting. My husband beside me stirred in his sleep. I turned the other way. The next day it rained, soft and persistent. I didn't expect him to come. But he did. He stood on the porch, soaked, holding a tarp and smiling. I offered him tea. He accepted. Inside, I handed him a towel, and he dried his hair in the kitchen while I poured the water. It felt normal. Too normal. He asked about the framed photo on the wall, me and my husband at a vineyard years ago. You look happy there, he said. I shrugged. That was a good day. He didn't ask more, and I was grateful. But something shifted. A line, maybe. Or the edge of one. Over the next few days, he worked inside, fixing the pantry door, the loose step, a broken window latch. I was around more. Made more tea. Asked more questions. He answered everyone. We laughed once, I don't even remember at what. I remember only the feeling. Like I had lungs again. My husband didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't mention it. He was distracted, emails, clients, sleep. At dinner, he told me about someone's divorce at work. Wife went crazy, he said, chewing steak. Just walked out one day. I asked, do you think people walk out suddenly, or does it build up over time? He looked confused. What? Nothing, I said, and cleared the plates. I watched the rain again that night. It hit the windows in slow, sad rhythms. I imagined him walking home under it. I wondered what music he liked. What he looked like when no one was watching. These weren't dangerous thoughts. Not yet. One afternoon, he asked if I'd help pick paint for the shed. I could use a second opinion, he said. I agreed before thinking. We stood in the store, staring at color swatches. He pointed to a soft green. It looks like something you'd choose. Why? I don't know, he said. It's calm, but not boring. I said nothing. Just folded the sample and slipped it into my purse. That evening, I set the sample card on the counter. My husband asked what it was. I told him. He nodded. Good. Let him handle that stuff. You shouldn't worry about it. But I wasn't worried. I was awake. That night, I looked at myself in the mirror. Noticed the way the skin around my eyes folded when I smiled. The way my collarbone still held shadows. I touched my face and wondered what he saw. Wondered if I even cared what anyone saw. Not everything changed that week. But something began. And beginnings, real ones, they don't announce themselves with trumpets. They arrive in footsteps across wet leaves. In glances held half a second too long. In the sound of someone humming outside your window, when you thought the world had forgotten your name. The next morning started like most others, with sunlight bleeding through the thin curtains and the familiar groan of the floorboards as I stepped into the hallway. The house felt cooler than usual, though it wasn't the temperature that gave me that impression. It was the space between moments, the kind of pause that only exists when something inside you has shifted, but you're still pretending nothing has. I made coffee and watched the garden, half expecting not to see him. But he was there, early as always, moving around the side of the house with a bag of tools slung over one shoulder. I watched the way he walked, grounded and steady, like he belonged wherever he stood. I hated that I noticed. Hated even more that I waited. He waved when he saw me at the window, and I gave a small nod in return before retreating into the kitchen. I wasn't ready for eye contact. Not after yesterday. Not after the way my breath had hitched when our hands touched. That moment had stayed with me all night. Each time I rolled over in bed, it returned, vivid and uninvited. By mid-morning, I brought him water and stood awkwardly while he knelt by the hedges. He looked up at me, shielding his eyes from the sun with a dirt-smudged glove. "Thanks," he said. I lingered. Told myself it was just polite. "I was thinking," he said as he stood, brushing dirt from his pants, "about adding some stone around the flower beds. Would frame them better." I nodded. "That sounds nice." He paused, watching me in that way he did, attentive but unreadable. "You okay today?" "Why wouldn't I be?" I said too quickly. "No reason," he said. "You just seem quieter." "I'm always quiet," I replied. He didn't argue. Just gave a half smile and returned to work. I walked back inside, trying to shake the feeling that he'd seen something I hadn't meant to show. Later that afternoon, I heard the hammering stop and looked outside. He was sitting on the porch step, wiping sweat from his neck with a rag. I hesitated before stepping outside. The air was thick and still. He glanced over as I approached. "You ever think about just leaving?" he asked. "Leaving what?" "Everything," he said. "Starting somewhere else. Somewhere no one knows your name." I sat beside him, careful to leave space between us. "Sometimes," I said. "But I always think I'd just end up being the same person, somewhere new." He didn't respond. Just stared out toward the garden. After a moment, he said, "Maybe it's not about the place." I didn't ask what it was about. I wasn't ready for the answer. That evening, my husband called. He said he'd be away for another 3 days. Something had come up. His voice was distant, like a man speaking through glass. I said I understood. I always did. After the call, I wandered the house aimlessly, touching things I hadn't noticed in weeks: the edge of the bookshelf, the chipped paint near the stairs, a photo frame with dust on the glass. I stared at our wedding picture, at the way I used to smile, wide and unguarded. I wasn't sure when that version of me disappeared. The next morning, I stood at the back door with 2 mugs of coffee. I didn't plan it. My body just moved. He was bent over the tool bench near the shed, humming something under his breath. When I called out, he turned, surprised. "I made extra," I said, holding out the cup. He took it with a thank you and a smile, and we stood there in silence, sipping as the morning sun pushed shadows across the lawn. "You ever wish you could pause time?" he asked. "All the time," I said. "What would you do if you could?" "I don't know. Breathe, maybe." He looked at me for a long moment. "I think you already are." We finished our coffee without another word. I returned inside, my hands shaking just enough to spill a few drops on the floor. That night, I took longer with my reflection. My fingers lingered on the fabric of my dress, smoothing it down over hips I'd grown used to hiding. My skin looked softer in the dim light, my eyes more awake. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. But I didn't turn away. The following afternoon, he knocked on the kitchen door instead of the back gate. "I finished early," he said. "Thought I'd ask about the paint you mentioned." "I haven't picked a color yet." "Then let's pick one." We drove into town in quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, just full. The hardware store was nearly empty, and we took our time browsing. He held up swatches and made jokes about names like Sunset Whisper and Antique Jade. I laughed more than I meant to. At one point, he turned to me with a soft expression and said, "This one looks like you." I didn't ask why. I just took the card and slipped it into my pocket. On the way back, it started raining. He pulled over under a small awning by a closed cafe. The rain hit the windshield like static, and we sat there, the world shrinking down to the space between us. "We don't have to pretend," he said, barely above a whisper. I turned to him. The moment stretched. We kissed. It happened before I could stop it. Before I could list all the reasons why we shouldn't. Then I opened the door and stepped into the rain, letting it soak my hair, my dress, my guilt. He didn't follow. Not then. I walked back into the house dripping, numb, and more awake than I'd been in years. The next day, I woke up before the alarm. The house was still quiet, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft tap of rain against the windows. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking of the kiss and everything it had stirred up. My heart felt like a tight knot of guilt and electricity, and my thoughts looped in endless circles, what it meant, what it didn't mean, what it had awakened. When I finally rose, I moved slower than usual, careful and deliberate in everything I did, as though some part of me believed that if I moved too fast, the truth might spill out. I washed my face twice. Brushed my hair for longer than needed. I picked a sweater I hadn't worn in years, one that used to make me feel like I was worth noticing, and then immediately questioned the decision, switching to something plain and soft, something forgettable. Downstairs, the house seemed colder than it had the day before, though the thermostat read the same. I made tea instead of coffee. The garden outside was slick with dew and early light, and I noticed the chair by the shed was slightly out of place. He had already been there this morning. Or maybe he had never left. I stayed inside for hours, folding laundry I didn't need to fold, rearranging the spice rack just for something to do. I kept glancing at the clock, at the window, then at my reflection in the glass, each time asking myself if I was imagining the change or if it had really happened. I couldn't trust my own judgment anymore. Not when I had crossed a line I swore didn't exist. By noon, I heard the usual sound of hammering. He was working on the gate now, fixing something that had never really needed fixing. I watched him from the kitchen, telling myself not to go out. Not yet. Not today. But after a while, the silence between the knocks and drills grew heavier than the noise itself. I poured water into a glass and stepped outside. He looked up as I approached but said nothing. I handed him the glass without a word. He took it, drank, and placed it on the workbench. His shirt was damp from sweat, and his arms bore small flecks of paint and dust. "I wasn't sure if you'd come out," he said finally, his voice low. "I wasn't sure either." He nodded and turned back to the fence, adjusting one of the hinges. I stood beside him, feeling the air stretch thin between us. The sun came out then, briefly, casting long shadows across the grass. For a moment, we said nothing. Just stood there, breathing the same air, holding the same silence. Later, I walked around to the front of the house and found myself standing at the mailbox, sifting through junk mail and catalogs. One envelope caught my eye, his name, scrawled in faint pen, tucked behind a gardening magazine. I hesitated, then walked it over to where he was working. "You got mail," I said, handing it to him. He took it, barely glancing at the envelope, and said, "Thanks." He didn't open it. Just placed it in his toolbox and continued working. I lingered again, unsure of what I was waiting for. "I meant to apologize," I said. "For what?" I paused. "I don't know." "Everything." He didn't respond right away. Then, without looking at me, he said, "You don't have to be sorry for feeling something." I wanted to believe him. But I didn't know how. The afternoon passed in fragments, me inside, him outside, the door between us like a thin layer of glass. I kept busy, if only to keep my thoughts at bay. I washed the same plate 3 times. Reorganized the linen closet. Listened to a podcast I couldn't remember the name of. When the sun began to dip low, casting that golden hour hue across the kitchen tiles, I found myself drawn to the garden again. He was packing up for the day, loading tools into the back of his truck. "Are you done for today?" I asked, surprising myself with how normal I sounded. Yeah, he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. Just about. I nodded, then added, thank you. For the fence. And everything else. He met my gaze then. It's not just the fence, is it? I opened my mouth to respond but didn't know what to say. My throat felt tight. So I just stood there, heart pounding in my chest, watching him drive away. That night, I set the table for two, even though I knew my husband wouldn't be home until the next evening. I couldn't bear to sit alone in front of the television again, holding a plate on my lap like some invisible guest. I needed the illusion of normalcy, even if it was paper thin. Dinner was quiet. The sound of utensils scraping ceramic was the only rhythm in the house. After I finished, I cleaned everything with meticulous care, scrubbing until my fingers ached, until the kitchen gleamed as if untouched. Then I sat on the couch, the silence wrapping around me like a second skin. Hours passed, though I wasn't sure how many. At one point, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone for vacations, birthdays, Sunday brunches. Smiling faces that now felt like actors in a play I barely remembered auditioning for. There was one of me, years ago, standing in front of a vineyard in a sundress, laughing at something out of frame. I looked at that version of myself and wondered what she would think of me now. Would she be disappointed? Would she understand? I turned off the screen and sat in the dark. The next morning came too soon. I woke with the weight of unfinished thoughts pressing down on my chest. I dressed quickly, pulled my hair into a loose bun, and forced myself to eat a piece of toast. Outside, the garden looked calm. No tools, no sound, just the early light stretching across damp soil. He didn't come that day. I waited until noon, then until 3. By 5, I stopped checking. A part of me was relieved. Another part, one I wasn't proud of, ached in his absence. I stood at the window, holding my cup of tea, watching the breeze stir the branches. And I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit: it wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented. About the space he had opened up inside me. A space that had been closed off for years without me even knowing. Later that evening, my husband called. He sounded tired but cheerful. Said he'd be home by lunch tomorrow. I told him I'd cook something he liked. He said that'd be nice. After the call, I sat alone again. And in that silence, I finally began to ask myself the question I'd been avoiding. What now? The morning sun arrived as a pale glow behind heavy clouds, casting a muted light across the kitchen tiles. I stood barefoot at the counter, stirring a pot of oatmeal without tasting it, the motion mechanical, the scent almost nauseating. Sleep hadn't visited me that night. My body had remained still in bed, but my mind had wandered, circling the same thoughts until they collapsed into one another, indistinct and exhausting. When I heard the faint thud of the gate outside, I didn't move. I stayed at the window, spoon in hand, watching as he entered the garden again, backpack slung over one shoulder, moving with the same quiet purpose as always. It surprised me. I had half convinced myself he wouldn't come back. A punishment, maybe. Or a retreat. He began working without looking toward the house. He moved to the far end of the yard, where the hedges had started curling wildly into the neighbor's fence. I watched him a while, then poured the oatmeal into the sink, rinsed the bowl, and went upstairs. I showered slowly, each drop of water feeling heavier than the last. I chose a plain gray sweater and soft black pants, clothes that didn't cling, didn't announce anything, didn't feel like armor or invitation. When I stepped outside with 2 cups of coffee, I kept my steps measured, like someone walking a tightrope in wind. He didn't turn around when I approached, just said thanks softly as I handed him the cup. We stood there in silence, listening to the birds flutter across the fence line and the low hum of a car passing 2 streets away. I wasn't sure you'd be here today, I said eventually. I wasn't either. I nodded, not pressing further. The breeze picked up slightly, brushing strands of hair across my face. I tucked them behind my ear, aware of his eyes following the motion. There's a spot by the shed that needs patching, he said. Some boards are starting to rot. You don't have to do that, I replied. I want to finish what I started. He turned then, and our eyes met. Just for a moment. Just long enough for everything that hadn't been said to press its weight between us again. He returned to work, and I walked back inside. For the rest of the day, I drifted from room to room, rearranging cushions, wiping already clean counters, refolding towels that didn't need it. I told myself I was preparing the house for my husband's return, but the truth was simpler. I needed movement, something to occupy the body while the mind unraveled quietly. In the afternoon, I drove into town. The hardware store was nearly empty, the smell of wood and dust familiar now. I wandered the aisles slowly, letting my fingers drift across paint cans, brushes, seed packets. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't my house. Somewhere I didn't feel watched, even by myself. I passed by a display of wind chimes, dozens of them, all different sizes and tones. I tapped one gently with the edge of my nail. The sound was soft and melancholy, like a memory you can't quite place. I stood there listening to the quiet chorus of hanging metal, feeling strangely unmoored. At the checkout counter, I bought a small bag of fertilizer and a ceramic planter I didn't need. Back home, he was gone. The tools were stacked neatly near the porch, and the boards by the shed were already replaced. I knelt to inspect them, running my hand across the smooth wood. There was no note, no message. Just his work, quiet and precise, like always. That evening, the rain returned. It started as a whisper on the roof, then thickened into steady percussion. I sat on the floor by the fireplace, knees drawn to my chest, wrapped in a throw blanket. I watched the water streak down the windows and thought about how many hours I had spent in silence lately, how much space I had filled with words I'd never said. I didn't cry. I wasn't sad, exactly. I wasn't anything I could name. Later, I opened my laptop and scrolled through old emails. I found one from my husband, dated nearly a year ago. It was short, a message sent during a business trip. It read, "Hope your day is okay. Let's plan that weekend getaway soon." I remembered replying, "Sounds good," though we never did plan anything. Life just kept getting in the way. It wasn't a bad marriage. That was the part one couldn't explain to anyone. There was no cruelty, no betrayal, no big explosion. Only a long, slow fade. Like a photograph left in the sun. The colors of us had simply softened and drifted apart, until neither of us could see the original shape anymore. The next morning arrived with a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it cautiously and found him standing there, holding a paint sample booklet in one hand and a hesitant expression in the other. "I thought maybe we could pick the color today," he said. I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages. Some colors were too loud, others too bland. He paused at a shade called Sea Smoke and said, "This feels like you." I didn't ask why. I just tore the sample from the booklet and set it on the counter. He stayed for tea. We talked about nothing. Tomatoes. Weather. Whether we should remove the overgrown ivy. But beneath every sentence was the tension of unsaid things. It sat with us at the table, between sips, under every pause. As he stood to leave, he turned back to me. "Do you regret it?" he asked. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The question felt too big, and the answer too small. After he left, I stood at the window and watched the rain begin again. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and whispered something only I could hear. That afternoon, my husband called. His voice was calm, warm. He told me he was tired but excited to be home. He asked if I'd made his favorite soup. I lied and said yes, then hung up and began chopping vegetables. As I moved through the motions of dinner, I thought about all the moments that had led to this one. The glances, the silences, the quiet unraveling of routines I once believed were fixed. And in that thought, I felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt. Not fear. But clarity. Not everything breaks with a sound. Some things shatter quietly. And sometimes, you don't realize they're broken until you're standing in the pieces. It was the morning he returned home. I woke before the sun and lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, aware of every breath, every shift in the sheets. My heart felt like a balloon held just below the point of bursting. The room was quiet, but not still. There was movement beneath the silence, like the house knew something had changed, even if the walls remained the same. I moved through the motions of getting ready. Showered. Dressed. Tied my hair back. Everything felt rehearsed, like a role I had once memorized but now struggled to perform with conviction. I ironed the blouse he liked. Made the bed with hospital corners. Polished the silverware. Not out of duty, but because I needed something to control. By 9, I had started the soup I promised him. The scent of garlic and onions filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, but I felt no comfort in it. I set the table for 2 and adjusted the napkins until they were symmetrical. My hands shook when I poured the water into glasses, so I wiped the rims twice. When I finally heard his car pull into the driveway, I froze. My hands went cold, my breath caught, and for a second, I considered running upstairs, locking the door, pretending to be asleep. But instead, I stood there, back straight, palms pressed flat against the counter. The front door opened with its usual creak. I heard the thud of his bag hitting the floor and the familiar sound of keys landing in the bowl. He called out my name, voice bright with travel-worn affection. I answered evenly, telling him I was in the kitchen. When he appeared in the doorway, he looked just as I remembered, tired around the eyes, a little unshaven, his tie loosened but still knotted. He smiled when he saw me and crossed the room to kiss my cheek. It was soft, distant, polite. The kind of kiss people give when they believe nothing has changed. I missed you, he said. I missed you too. It wasn't a lie. I had missed something. Maybe not him exactly, but the version of me I used to be when he was close. Before everything slipped sideways. We sat down to eat. He told me about his meetings, the hotel food, the driver who got lost. I nodded, smiled where I should, asked follow-up questions. I watched his hands as he spoke, how they moved with conviction, how he still gestured when describing something mundane. And I wondered how many details of me he had stopped noticing. When he complimented the soup, I thanked him. I didn't say it was the same recipe I had used for years. I didn't remind him that he'd forgotten I used to add rosemary, and that I had stopped because he once said it overpowered the broth. I just let him believe it was new. After lunch, he unpacked in the bedroom while I cleaned the kitchen. I scrubbed harder than necessary, as if the dishes held residue beyond what the sponge could reach. When I finished, I walked out to the garden. He followed a few minutes later, his jacket draped over one arm, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He handed me one and joined me on the bench near the newly repaired shed. It was quiet outside, the air cool, the sky mottled with clouds. Place looks good, he said, nodding toward the work that had been done. He's been coming regularly, I replied. You picked someone reliable. He took a sip of coffee and didn't speak for a moment. Then, almost casually, he said, he seems young. I looked at him. He is. Friendly, too. Is that a problem? No, he said, slowly. Just noticing. We didn't say anything else for a while. The silence between us felt familiar. We had lived inside it for years. But today, it felt like something heavier. Something sharper. Later, after he went inside to rest, I stayed in the garden. I ran my fingers along the edge of the bench, over the grain of the wood, the ridges where the nails had been replaced. The boards were smooth, new. And yet, sitting there felt like inhabiting a memory that hadn't yet finished forming. When I stood to go back inside, I saw him again, just past the gate. He was unloading materials from his truck, headphones in, unaware that I was watching. The sight of him jolted me in a way I didn't expect. Not because I was surprised, but because something inside me had already started measuring the distance between us again. I walked back inside and closed the door behind me. That evening, the three of us were in the same place for the first time. My husband worked in his office upstairs. I prepared dinner in the kitchen. The young man hammered something in the backyard. We were each enclosed in our own world, separate but adjacent, like parallel lines that should never intersect. And yet, I couldn't ignore the subtle gravity between us. When I brought out a pitcher of lemonade near sunset, he looked up from the flower bed he was restoring and thanked me. I nodded, about to turn away, when he said, "You seem different today." "How so?" "I don't know," he said. "You look pulled in two directions." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My voice didn't belong to me in that moment. We kissed. It hung in the air between us, simple and undeniable. He didn't move toward me. He didn't smile. He simply said it like a fact, like pointing out that the sky had turned orange or that the wind had shifted. I stood there, frozen, the pitcher cold in my hand. For a moment, I thought my legs might give out beneath me. But instead, I turned and walked back into the house. Inside, the light had changed. The kitchen was bathed in amber and shadow, and I stood alone, watching the dust swirl in the glow of the setting sun. That night, my husband reached for me in bed. It wasn't passion. It wasn't even desire. It was habit, routine. I turned toward him and allowed the embrace, eyes open, heart closed, body still. He whispered, "It's good to be home," and I said nothing. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening to his breathing and the hum of the fan, counting the seconds between each rise and fall of his chest. And in the darkness, I began to realize something I hadn't allowed myself to before. The line I crossed hadn't been a single step. It had been a slow drift. Quiet. Almost unnoticeable. Until now. The morning after felt like waking into a life I wasn't sure belonged to me anymore. The kitchen, the hallway, the very shape of the house, I moved through it all like someone playing a part they no longer understood. My husband sat at the breakfast table reading the paper, his coffee cooling untouched beside him. He looked up briefly to smile at me as I passed, and I forced a small one in return. That was the extent of our exchange. I stepped outside to the garden just as he emerged from the side gate. He was early, or maybe I had simply lost track of time. He carried a coil of wire over one shoulder and glanced at me only briefly before setting his tools down. No words were exchanged. No nods. Just a long, quiet acknowledgement that settled between us like dust. I busied myself with watering the smaller potted plants along the fence. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted the hose nozzle, the fine spray misting my sleeves. He worked a few feet away, replacing some trellis slats that had warped in the sun. I could feel his presence, the closeness of him, and yet neither of us moved beyond the tasks in front of us. Eventually, my husband appeared in the doorway, coffee in hand, watching us. He leaned casually against the frame, making some comment about how the garden looked better than it ever had. I nodded. He didn't step down, just sipped from his mug, then returned inside. I felt his absence more than his presence. Later that day, we all ended up in the same space again. I was baking in the kitchen, preparing something simple, banana bread, the kind my husband always liked. The smell drifted through the house, soft and sweet, like a memory trying to comfort. He passed through and thanked me for making it, kissing the top of my head as he went. The touch felt foreign, like a borrowed gesture from a different couple. Through the kitchen window, I watched him, the one I had kissed, digging along the side path, resetting bricks that had come loose with the rain. His movements were slow and precise, his shirt damp at the collar, hair falling slightly across his forehead. I looked away too quickly, my hands fumbling a bowl that nearly slipped from the counter. The knock came late in the afternoon. Not at the front door, but at the side, where we usually kept the recycling bins. I opened it and found him standing there, hands in his pockets, dirt still clinging to his nails. He didn't speak at first. Neither did I. "Finished the trellis," he said. I nodded. "Thank you. I'll probably take the weekend off," he added. "Got something to do out of town." There was a pause. Long enough to let silence stretch and wrap around us. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. "Not really." He looked like he wanted to say more, like something was weighing behind his eyes, but instead he gave a short nod and turned to leave. That night, my husband and I sat on the couch together for the first time in what felt like weeks. A film played quietly on the television, though neither of us paid it much attention. He rested his hand gently on my leg, a familiar gesture, safe and known. I didn't move away. But I didn't lean in either. When he eventually fell asleep beside me, head tilted back slightly, mouth parted in soft breath, I stared at the flickering light from the screen and felt the ache of stillness. Everything in my life was still. And yet inside me, something moved. Something I couldn't name, couldn't cage. The next morning, I found a note tucked into the tool shed door. Just a folded piece of paper, no envelope, no name. I recognized the handwriting immediately. "Thank you for letting me be part of something that mattered. Even if it was only for a while." I read it twice, then folded it back the way it had come and slipped it into the pocket of my sweater. My husband spent most of the weekend reading in his office. He offered to go for a walk with me on Sunday morning, but I told him I had chores to finish. That wasn't a lie, there were things to do. But the truth was deeper. I didn't know how to walk beside him anymore without hearing the echo of all the words I hadn't said. By Sunday afternoon, the garden felt different. Quieter. Like something had been removed, and the space left behind hadn't yet settled. I sat on the bench near the shed, where the sun cut across the lawn in thin gold lines. The breeze rustled the ivy gently, and I closed my eyes, just for a moment, to listen. When I opened them, I imagined he was still there, somewhere on the far end of the yard, working silently, humming under his breath. But the gate was closed. The tools were gone. The space was empty. That evening, I set the table for two again. My husband complimented the food. Asked how I was feeling. I said I was fine. He nodded, satisfied. We ate in silence. After dinner, I stood at the sink and stared out the window while the plates soaked. The garden was dark now, just shadows and the faint outline of trees. I imagined what it would feel like to start over somewhere else. A new town. A different house. No expectations. No history. But then I remembered, people don't escape their lives by moving. They carry them. Folded and pressed deep inside. Later, while folding laundry, I found the note again. I read it once more, slower this time, tracing the letters with the edge of my thumb. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was just a farewell. Quiet and honest. And somehow, that made it harder to bear. When I finally went to bed, my husband was already asleep. I slipped under the covers, careful not to disturb him, and lay there staring at the ceiling once more. The fan turned above us, humming in its slow, steady rhythm. I closed my eyes and tried to remember how it felt to belong. Not to someone, but to myself. The weekend ended without any fanfare. No argument, no breakthrough, just the slow exhale of ordinary days. On Monday morning, my husband left for work wearing his usual gray jacket and carrying his usual quiet detachment. He kissed my cheek as he always did, and I smiled, like I always did, though neither of us asked how the other slept. When the door clicked shut behind him, I stood in the hallway for a long while, listening to the ticking of the clock above the coat rack. The house was still. Not peaceful, just still. The kind of silence that made you aware of your own footsteps, your own breath. By midday, I had done every task I could think of: laundry, wiping baseboards, clearing the fridge, watering the plants that didn't need it. Still, time felt thick and slow, like honey refusing to fall from the spoon. I considered calling a friend, but the thought of small talk, of pretending, felt heavier than solitude. In the late afternoon, I drove to the grocery store. I moved slowly through the aisles, picking up items I didn't need. I paused at the bakery section, fingers brushing over a box of his favorite cookies. I almost placed it in the cart, then set it back. Some rituals lose meaning when performed alone. When I got home, the note was still in my pocket. I hadn't thrown it away. I hadn't reread it either. But its presence was a weight I carried from room to room. I wasn't ready to let it go. Not because I was holding on to him, but because it reminded me of the version of myself who had existed in those brief, unexpected moments. That evening, I found myself outside again. The sun was low, casting a warm orange light across the garden. The bench near the shed was empty, as it had been for days. The boards he'd replaced were clean, smooth, almost too perfect, like they hadn't been touched by life yet. I sat down and watched the sky shift color. The air was still, heavy with the scent of soil and late summer leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then silence returned. And then, footsteps. I didn't turn right away. I knew it was him. Not by sound, but by the subtle shift in the air. A pause. A presence. He stepped into view, hands in his jacket pockets, expression unreadable. He didn't come closer at first. Just stood a few feet away, as though waiting for something from me. "I thought you were out of town," I said, not rising from the bench. "I was," he answered simply. I looked at him then, really looked. His eyes were tired, his posture tense. But beneath that, something softer lived, regret maybe, or hesitation. "Why are you here?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure I should come back." "But you did." I couldn't not. We stood in silence, either of us moving. The sky above us shifted to deeper blue, and the first stars began to appear, faint and tentative. I exhaled slowly. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Neither do I. His honesty sat between us, unadorned, without expectation. "I didn't plan any of this," I said. "I know. I don't want to be the kind of person who hides behind a moment." "You're not." "How would you know?" "Because you were never hiding from me." That stopped me. He took a small step closer, then paused again. "We don't have to make this something it's not." I closed my eyes. The air was cooler now, brushing across my arms and neck, reminding me I was real, that this wasn't a memory or a thought experiment. I started, then stopped. "I just don't know who I am anymore," and I'm afraid that if I let this mean something, then everything else will fall apart. He sat beside me, but didn't touch me. Didn't reach. He just sat, close enough for warmth, far enough for space. I think, he said, sometimes things have to fall apart before we can figure out what was holding them together. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. And then, we spent the night together. There is nothing more to add. No description. No details. Only the fact of it, held quietly like a pebble in the palm, weighty and small. The next morning, I woke before him. The room was dim, the blinds still drawn. His breathing was even, soft, the way it had been on afternoons when he worked in the garden and rested against the porch for just a minute too long. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. A worn chair, an old desk, a cracked window pane. Nothing magical. Nothing sacred. Just space. But inside me, something had settled. Not peace, not regret. Something closer to stillness. I dressed in silence and left without waking him. Back home, the kitchen smelled like dust and yesterday's coffee. My husband hadn't returned yet. He had stayed the night at a colleague's house after a late meeting. I was grateful. I needed time to remember who I was supposed to be. I took a long shower, letting the water wash over the weight I couldn't yet name. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there, breathing. Later, I changed the sheets. I folded laundry. I threw the note away. And when the sun began to set again, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew I couldn't pretend nothing had. I spent most of that day in silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that hums beneath the skin, sharp and persistent. My hands moved through the familiar rhythm of daily tasks, folding, wiping, arranging, but my thoughts were scattered, like broken glass on a kitchen floor. Nothing fit together the way it used to. Every sound, every movement felt louder, more defined, more permanent. When my husband came home in the early afternoon, his presence filled the house instantly. He dropped his bag near the front door, kicked off his shoes like always, and called my name with a warmth that made my stomach tighten. I answered from the kitchen, voice even, measured. He walked in and leaned against the doorway, watching me slice vegetables for dinner. He asked about my day. I gave him the usual replies. He nodded, seemed satisfied. Told me about traffic, a delayed meeting, someone at work who had finally quit. I smiled at the right moments. But I could feel it, that distance between what I was saying and what I was feeling. Like trying to speak underwater. We sat down to eat around 6. The house was quiet except for the sound of forks against plates. He complimented the stew. I thanked him. It was a meal we had shared 100 times before, but everything about it felt different now. Like we were actors reading lines in a play we no longer believed in. After dinner, he offered to do the dishes. I declined. I needed something to keep my hands busy. While I cleaned, he stepped outside for a call, pacing along the back patio as the sky darkened above him. Through the window, I watched the way his shoulders rose and fell with his speech. There was no anger in his tone, no urgency. Just normalcy. Predictable. Controlled. And then, out of nowhere, a second figure appeared in the corner of the yard. A silhouette. Familiar. My heart stopped. He was standing near the garden bed, motionless. Watching. My husband didn't see him, his back was turned. I stared, frozen, a sponge limp in my hand. For a moment, everything paused, the air, my breath, the entire world seemed to hold itself in place. Then my husband turned. Their eyes met. No words were spoken, at least, none that I could hear. but the stillness between them was deafening. My husband lowered the phone slowly, still staring at him. His expression changed gradually, from confusion to something colder, sharper. He took a few steps forward, not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. The other man didn't move. He stood his ground, hands by his sides, as though he had nothing to hide, as though he expected this moment and had accepted it. I rushed outside, barefoot, the cold concrete biting at my soles. My husband turned toward me, face unreadable. "Is there something you want to explain?" he asked, not raising his voice. I opened my mouth but nothing came out. He looked back at the man, then again at me. The air was thick. No one spoke. No one moved. Finally, the man broke the silence. "I came to collect a tool I left." It was a lie. We all knew it. But my husband didn't call it out. He just nodded once. "Then take it." He walked past him, back into the house, the screen door closing behind him with a sharp click. The man turned to me. I couldn't meet his eyes. "I shouldn't have come," he said. I shook my head. "Not now. Not like this." He gave a small nod, then turned and left. His footsteps faded down the path, swallowed by the dark. When I went back inside, my husband was standing in the living room, arms crossed. He looked calm. Too calm. "I saw the way you looked at him," he said. I didn't deny it. "I saw it before," he added. I just didn't want to believe it. I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, the cushion barely shifting beneath me. "You've been different," he continued. "Not just lately. 4 months." "I know," I whispered. He walked to the window and stood there for a long time, staring into the garden. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to make anything better. Every word I wanted to say sounded like an excuse before it even formed. "I don't want to fight," he said finally. "But I can't pretend I didn't see what I saw." "I'm not asking you to pretend." "Then what are you asking?" I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. That night, we slept in the same bed, backs turned, oceans apart. The silence between us was no longer gentle. It was jagged, restless. It echoed in every corner of the room. I didn't sleep. I watched the ceiling, the slow spin of the fan, the shifting shadows as headlights passed by on the street. I thought about the garden. About the moment his eyes met mine. About the wordless confession that passed between us. And I thought about my husband, standing there with the truth half-formed in his throat, choosing not to spit it out. The next morning, he left for work without much said. A short goodbye. No kiss. No smile. I stood at the window long after he drove away, watching the empty street. The garden was still. No tools. No motion. Just silence. The phone rang once in the kitchen. I didn't answer. I sat at the table with my tea going cold, staring at the knot in the wood grain. I had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. But the hardest part wasn't the guilt. It was realizing that the person I had been before, it wasn't someone I could return to. Not anymore. The house felt quieter than it had in weeks. Not peaceful, just vacant in a way that didn't come from absence, but from something far more subtle, like air that no longer carried the weight of trust. I moved through the morning as if I were walking underwater, everything slowed, muted, held back. The kitchen was clean, the garden untouched, and the hallway still smelled faintly of last night's silence. My husband had left early. No note. No words beyond the brief "I'll be gone before you're up" from the night before. It wasn't anger. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't slammed doors. But there was something far more painful in that calm restraint. The way he looked at me like I had become a stranger in our shared life. A shadow at his breakfast table. A voice he couldn't match with the woman he had married. I stayed inside most of the day. I didn't open the curtains, didn't check the garden, didn't look toward the shed. I made tea and let it go cold. I scrolled through old text messages with no real intent, just watching the names of people who hadn't heard from me in weeks. Maybe months. I had pulled away slowly, imperceptibly, until the only conversations I had were with my own thoughts, and even they had started to avoid me. By noon, the walls felt too close. I took a walk through the neighborhood aimless, head down, hoping not to run into anyone I knew. The houses looked the same as always, neatly trimmed lawns, garden gnomes, flags flapping lazily in the breeze. But I imagined what it might look like from the outside, a woman in comfortable clothes, wandering with purpose she didn't have, wearing a face too neutral to read. When I returned home, the mail was sticking out from the box. I sifted through bills, flyers, a catalog for fall furniture. At the bottom was an envelope with no return address. My name handwritten in tight, slanted letters. I knew instantly who it was from. I didn't open it. Not yet. I left it on the kitchen counter like something too hot to touch, and moved to the sink to wash my hands even though they were already clean. The letter stayed unopened for hours. I pretended to forget about it. Cooked pasta, overboiled it. Did laundry I didn't need to do. Wiped the dining table even though we hadn't used it since guests came months ago. But eventually, I sat at the counter with the envelope in front of me, hands trembling slightly as I slipped my finger under the flap. The note was short. Just a few lines, careful and unassuming. I'm not asking you to explain anything. I only wanted to say thank you, for the days that felt like they belonged to no one else. Whatever happens now, I hope you find something that feels honest. Even if it's not me. I read it again. And again. Then I folded it neatly and slid it into the back of a drawer where I kept old warranties and faded takeout menus. I didn't know why. I just couldn't throw it away. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of motion. I vacuumed the corners of the living room. Scrubbed the grout near the bathroom sink. Cleaned out the pantry, tossing jars whose expiration dates had long passed. The house became cleaner, but the weight inside me didn't lighten. When evening fell, I went out to the garden. The air was cooler, the kind that hints at the beginning of the season's end. The bench near the shed was empty, of course, but I sat there anyway, tucking my legs beneath me. The sky above was soft gray, streaked with clouds that caught the last light like old lace. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind threading through the leaves, the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking once, then falling quiet again. There was something grounding in the stillness, something almost kind. As though the world, at least for now, had stopped asking anything of me. When I returned inside, I noticed a light blinking on the answering machine. A message had come through while I was outside. I pressed the button. It was my husband's voice. Hey. I'm going to stay at the apartment tonight. I just need time to think. I'll check in tomorrow. I hope you're okay. That was it. No accusation. No demand. Just quiet resignation. I stood there long after the message ended, staring at the machine like it might rewind itself and say something else. But it didn't. Just a blinking red light. Waiting for someone to press delete. I didn't delete it. Instead, I made tea again. This time I drank it while it was hot. Then I sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of wood as the house settled into the night. I thought about all the things I wanted to say to him, but hadn't. Thought about the man who had sent the letter, and all the things we hadn't said out loud because the truth had become too big for words. And I thought about myself. Not as a wife. Not as a woman who had made a mistake. But as someone who had been standing still for too long, waiting for life to feel like hers again. By the time the clock hit 10, I had pulled out a small overnight bag and packed a change of clothes, a book, a toothbrush. Not because I planned to leave permanently. Not even because I needed space. But because I needed one night in a different air, in a place where my silence didn't echo so loud. I left a note on the table. I'm okay. I just need to breathe. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped into the quiet night. The motel was quiet, tucked off a side road just outside of town. Its sign flickered faintly in the night, one letter half lit, the rest buzzing like an old habit trying to be remembered. I had passed it dozens of times before, always in a hurry, never giving it a second thought. But that night, it became a kind of sanctuary, not because it offered comfort, but because it offered nothing. No expectations. No explanations. Just four walls, a bed, and a door that could be closed with a single click. The room smelled faintly of cleaning products and old air. The carpet was thin, the lamp by the bed slightly tilted. Still, I felt oddly calm as I set down my bag, turned on the small TV to a low volume, and sat on the edge of the mattress. I didn't watch the screen. I just listened to the murmuring voices, the shifting music, as though they were speaking to someone I used to be. For the first time in what felt like weeks, I didn't feel watched. Not by him. Not by myself. I didn't have to choose my words or monitor the weight of my footsteps. I breathed. Slowly, deeply, without bracing for consequence. I slept in fragments that night. Small bursts of rest interrupted by pockets of thought. My mind wandered not to what had happened, but to what hadn't. To the pauses, the hesitations, the nearly spoken truths. I didn't replay scenes, I sat with the feeling of them, let them pass through me without grabbing on. At dawn, I opened the blinds and watched the sky shift from gray to gold. The parking lot below was mostly empty, just a few scattered cars and a delivery truck pulling out toward the main road. I boiled water for tea in the small kitchenette and sipped it slowly as the light warmed the edges of the room. I didn't want to go back. But I knew I would. Not because I owed it to anyone. Not because there was something waiting to be salvaged. But because I had chosen that life once, and before I could make a different choice, I needed to understand the one I'd already made. Around 9, I gathered my things and left the room as quietly as I had entered. The woman at the front desk didn't ask questions. She handed me my receipt with a polite smile and a quick glance that didn't linger. I appreciated that more than I expected. The drive home was short. 15 minutes. Enough time to watch the town wake up. People walking dogs, opening shops, sipping coffee at outside tables. Everything looked normal. Familiar. And yet I couldn't stop thinking about how many lives were being lived beneath the surface of this ordinary morning. How many quiet endings. How many invisible shifts. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same. Still. Pale in the morning light. A place that didn't yet know what had changed. Inside, the air was cool. My note was still on the table where I left it. The kettle sat on the stove, untouched. No signs of movement. I wasn't surprised. I knew he wasn't here. I wandered through the rooms slowly, as if seeing them for the first time. The living room with the blanket draped over the arm of the couch. The bathroom counter with his razor still by the sink. The bedroom, where the sheets were slightly wrinkled, the pillow on his side untouched. He hadn't come back. I sat on the bed and stared at the open closet door. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad. Just emptied out. As if the storm had already passed, and now I was standing in the wreckage, unsure of what was worth rebuilding. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I froze for a moment, the sound too sharp in the quiet house. I moved slowly to the door and opened it. It was him. Not my husband. The other him. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, eyes searching mine for something I couldn't name. I didn't invite him in. I didn't step outside. We just stood like that, on opposite sides of a doorway, holding all the weight of what we hadn't said. "I heard he left," he said quietly. I nodded. "I wasn't sure if I should come. I wasn't sure if I wanted you to." He looked down for a moment, then back at me. "I didn't come to make this harder." "Then why did you?" He hesitated. "Because I needed to see if you were okay." I didn't answer right away. The question was too large for a yes or no. "I don't know what I am," I finally said. He gave a small nod, as if he understood more than he was letting on. "I meant what I wrote," he added. Even if it didn't change anything. I believed him. But belief didn't equal direction. It didn't erase what had happened or clarify what should happen next. "Maybe we were never meant to be anything," I said. "Maybe not." We stood in silence again. Long enough for the moment to settle into something that felt like closure, or the beginning of it. "I need time," I said. "Not to choose between you and him. To choose myself." He didn't protest. He didn't plead. He just said, "Then take it." And then he left. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, eyes closed, palms flat against the wood. The house felt different now. Lighter, somehow. That afternoon, I started cleaning again. Not out of guilt or distraction, but because I needed to feel my hands doing something real. I emptied drawers, sorted through old letters, threw away the little things that had been weighing on me without my knowing. When I reached the back of the closet, I found an old scarf I hadn't worn in years. It smelled faintly of lavender and dust. I held it for a long time, remembering the version of myself who once wore it with confidence, with ease. Not as a wife. Not as a mistake. Just a woman. A woman who had once felt sure of something. And who maybe, with time, could feel that again. I folded the scarf neatly, placed it back on the shelf, and stood up straighter. I didn't know what would happen next. But I wasn't afraid of finding out.